Afternoon. Well, I've got my Springer in bits, the HW95. I thought I'd do a video on the basics of Springer tuning, what it actually means, the different types. So this is a standard HW95 piston. It's usually inside the gun. It's got a latch rod here that catches on the trigger when it's pulled back, and it pushes against a spring. And when it catches, you release the trigger, the piston pushes forward inside the cylinder and pushes air through a small hole in the front called the transfer port, and that's what pushes the air down the barrel. So on a lot of the brand new Springers, or even on some of the higher end ones, you get a noise on firing. People call it twanging. It's just spring vibration. So it's either the spring vibrating inside the piston because there's a bit of play, or you will have a guide as standard on the HW95 and 99. It might be plastic. On some of the bigger ones it might be metal, but often if there's play in between the spring and the guide, you will get that twanging noise. So the simple cure to that, the most basic form of tuning, would be to get a set of new guides. I think without checking they're about 20-25 quid, and that's the kind of thing. These are TBT ones. Somebody's cut that way too short for this gun, the previous owner, but that's the most basic form. So all that does is replace the guide that came with the gun, so it'll be better fitting in the spring. It also comes with a top hat that goes in the other end. This is actually a TBT spring, and then that fits inside the piston, so it should fit better in there as well. All that does really is quieten everything down, so it stops that spring vibration, it stops that twanging noise on firing, but it can make a huge difference to the way that the gun feels. It makes it feel much tighter, much quieter, and it can really transform a standard gun. But essentially, although it might be listed for sale as tuned, that's all that may have been done. It may just be different spring guides. The next step up from that, if you're going to do it, have a go yourself at home, would be a set of those guides with the matching spring. So those spring guides are machined to fit this spring exactly, which means you don't have to then worry about trying to get your new spring guide to fit your old spring. The other issue with that is when you get a spring included, quite often you have to take coils off and refinish the end to keep it within a legal power restriction, so that can be a bit fiddly if you have to keep coming back, taking a little bit off, refinishing it, testing it again. But that's an option. You can do that yourself. You can buy a kit. The other thing people tend to sell in kits to do yourself is what's called short stroking. All short stroking is lessening the distance that piston travels down the cylinder. So that's usually done in one of two ways. Either you buy something like that in a kit. This is often HW80, so it's a bigger piston, but that fits where the seal would be, and then the seal goes in front of that. So it's essentially just lengthening the piston, so shortening the stroke down the cylinder. The other way of doing that is to change the length of the latch rod, because that's what catches on the triggers here, but they're both essentially shortening the distance in between the front of the seal and the transfer port. My experience with home kit short stroking hasn't been great. In fact, this came off my HW80. I didn't like it. I took it off and had it tuned by somebody, and I did the same on my TX200, and I wasn't keen on the short stroke extension. But there are all options that you can do from home, and if all you want to do is quieten down the gun, I would say spring guide, maybe spring as well, would be all you'd need to do. Once you kind of move past that point, you're getting into the realms of playing around with transfer port sizes, so the hole in the end of the cylinder, what's the diameter of the hole, what's the length of the transfer port. As I say, the changing the stroke, the length of the piston, how far it travels down the bore. They're all things that you can play around with yourself at home, but I would say it's probably easier to make it worse than it is to make it better. You really need some understanding of what you're doing, otherwise, despite it being a tuning kit, you can actually make things a lot worse. When you get past that point, you're really looking in the realms of the custom gunsmiths, the tuners. Maybe people can have a go at home if they've got some engineering experience, they've got a lathe. But obviously the weight of that piston is not going to change no matter what the guide setup, whether you slightly change the stroke, you've still got that mass travelling backwards and forwards and backwards in the cylinder, and that's what gives you the majority of the recoil. So the next step would be to try and lighten the mass moving inside the cylinder. So a lot of the tuners, they will put this on a lathe and machine out a certain depth of the middle, and that will lighten the piston. And then instead of just having, you can see on the back of that piston where it's been rubbing, the flange, the skirt at the back rubs on the inside of the cylinder. So people who are capable with a lathe can machine in Delrin bands around here so that the whole piston runs on Delrin rather than there being any metal to metal contact. That makes them super smooth to use. Any imperfections on the inside of the cylinder just wearing as grooves on the Delrin bands, so after a few shots it beds in, and then it's slick. You get none of the roughness that you would get in a standard rifle. So that would be gliding, and that looks something like that. So you can see the Delrin bands machined into front and back. So the whole piston just runs on those. You can only lighten the standard steel piston so far, because you know otherwise you're going to ruin its structural integrity, and it's still made out of steel, so it's still going to have a certain amount of weight. You go past that point, you've only really got two options: either change the material. This is a pull short titanium one that came out of my HW95. It is a fraction of the weight of the steel one. It's slightly narrower because it's got the Delrin bands taking up the difference, but it's night and day. There is no way you could get a steel piston anything like as light as that, and it's super strong. He actually makes those from scratch. He makes them all custom made. Alternative to that would be to have a smaller diameter piston, but then that involves having to sleeve the barrel down to fit the smaller piston. Then obviously that would give you less weight moving forwards as well. It does come with some other issues. Obviously the smaller piston moving less air forward, so you either need to increase the stroke or have more spring behind it. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of it, and this was just a simple explanation, but I don't have any of the 22mm kits to show you, but that's how they work. You just sleeve the cylinder, very small piston inside, and that gives you less mass. My personal preference is just to have a standard shaped and sized piston just made out of a very, very light material. That gives virtually no recoil. If you go to a custom gunsmith, they will obviously match it up with a suitable spring. This is a lubricated Titan spring with a guide made specifically for that. I have the same piston in my TX200, but Paul made a metal guide that's machined into the M block. They really are beautifully made, and obviously a different piston seal. I think it's one of the Aussie ones, but I know there's other tuners following the same kind of guide, perhaps not made out of titanium. I'm not sure anybody else is making the titanium ones, but certainly there are people lightening the originals and gliding them. As to what tuning you should go for, just depends on what you need, really, doesn't it? I think if you're just using a gun around the farm, it's a bit noisy, you want to quieten it down, or the old spring is knackered and you're going to replace those anyway, then perhaps a spring and guide set is going to be all that you need. It's going to improve on the way it was before, and it wouldn't be worth going any further with any of the custom tuning or anything. for those who are perhaps using their guns in competition, they need super consistency, super reliability, and the least possible recoil. Then obviously going for a custom gunsmith, somebody who can set it up properly, very light, well-engineered materials, it's going to be worth it. Likewise, somebody who just wants a tuned rifle, but it's worth bearing in mind that when people say tuned, it can mean anything from taking the original piston out and giving it a bit of a polish and deburring everything, putting it back together, all the way to custom internals, titanium pistons, 22mm kits all sleeved down, and anything in between. So it's worth asking, whether you're buying a rifle that's been tuned by somebody at home, and I would say be cautious of that. You don't know that they knew what they were doing. Or you're buying a pre-tuned one from one of the shops that are now selling it. Ask what it is exactly that has been done, and then you'll know whether it's worth the extra price on top of the standard rifle. As to whether it's worth it, just depends what you want from it. I would say, I home tuned loads of my rifles over the years. New springs, guides, that kind of thing, short stroke extensions. I've never got them to shoot as well as one of the, professionally tuned custom setups. They're just another level. But having said that, depending on how much you actually use your rifle and what you use it for, it may not be worth going to that extent. I would say if you're considering custom tuning, Paul Short is my favourite. I don't know anybody else that's making these titanium pistons. I prefer pistons with a skirt rather than the skirtless types. It's just personal preference, and I really like the very, very fast shot cycle, virtually no recoil because there's no weight to this, but it makes good power. I asked for this HW95 to be about mid-11s because it was my main hunting rifle, and that's exactly where it is. In fact, if it creeped any higher, I'd want to start taking a coil off and reducing it. So brilliantly made bit of kit. I know there are others out there doing similar things. Other people swear by the 22mm kits, but for me, they're my favourite. I hope that helped somebody if you're thinking about getting some kind of tuning done or thinking about buying a tuned rifle. At least you know what to look for, and it's by no means comprehensive, but just a basic breakdown of what people are doing when they're tuning springers.